Terraria was released on the 16th of May 2011 on Steam, and a couple years later on the 13th of September 2013 on mobile. While going through some of my old devices, I found an old version of Terraria for Android. According to what I found online, it is the first ever version released for mobile. I'll be going over how I found this, how I managed to play it, and how you might be able to as well. But if you don't care about any of that, skip to this timestamp on screen for the actual gameplay. But anyways, I've known Terraria almost since launch, but the first version of Terraria I played properly was the mobile version on Android. And with that being the case, I basically grew up on Terraria, and obviously I still play it now. But the first ever time I played Terraria was on a computer from 2006 running Windows Vista. I still actually have the computer, but unfortunately it won't boot up. I can't even show you the errors because it's missing just about every component. And originally I thought it was missing the hard drive, so I checked every old hard drive that I had, but unfortunately none of them belonged to this computer. It turns out the hard drive was actually just in the computer, which I'm not sure how I missed, but anyways, I was able to find the first ever Terraria worlds and player that I used. For anyone wondering, they were dated back to 2013. Unfortunately, I was too young to understand what I was supposed to do in the game, so there was nothing overly meaningful in the worlds. I was also able to get the Terraria version of files, but it ended up being version 1.1.2. This is one of a few versions that anybody can play normally, without having to download a third-party program. I also found a weird Terraria installer for that version. This would have been my cousin who downloaded it, so I don't know where it came from, but I wasn't able to find any information on Google about this installer. From what I found, it's likely an unofficial third-party installer. For anyone who's curious, I ran it, but nothing ended up happening. It seems like the website that was hosting this was bought by a different company, but this is likely a topic for a different video. But anyways, let's get back to the actual point of the video. While searching through the files of some of my old tablets that I used as a kid, I found an APK dated to April 9th, 2014. For those who don't know what APKs are, it's basically a file that installs an app onto an Android device. The file name also contained the word full in brackets, meaning this was the full version of Terraria as opposed to the free one. And for those unaware, many of the first mobile versions of Terraria also had a free one. The free one basically allowed you to play the tutorial, but that was it. Now with that being said, I think it is still possible to beat the free version of Terraria, but then again, that's probably a topic for another video. The file name also said it was version 1.0, but I wanted to make sure this was the case first, so I did some digging and it turns out this may not have been the first version. So going over what I found, the build number was 2331. Remember this number because I end up referencing it later. But while going through the assets of the APK, I found image files containing the images for hard mode items and bosses. So looking at the version list on the wiki, it said it was version 1.1.5822, but then I remembered the Lepus boss. Because I basically grew up on the mobile version, I knew that this boss existed at one point in the game, but I couldn't find the images for it, nor could I find any other references to it. This boss was from version 1.1.92, and you may be wondering, this has a higher version number than the hard mode update, why does this actually matter? Well, as you can see, the version number for some reason goes down. This makes it a little confusing finding the actual version, but we can actually ignore this, as for some reason, the hard mode content was actually added before this, as hard mode content was actually added in version 1.1.8, but for some reason everything was unobtainable. But I was also looking at the rest of the update content, and it adds Valentine's Day related content, but then I realized that there were no images or references to the content in the game files, which means that the game version would have had to have been before this version, but also contained stuff from this version. And it turns out the same thing happens with version 1.0.5, as images of Santa and presents exist, but none of the other content, and any versions previous to this don't add any content, which makes it kind of hard to figure out which version it actually is. However, there is one thing that we can check. If the fixes of 1.0.1 are not in the game, then it is version 1.0, and after quickly drinking a potion, the selected item is not set back to its original one, meaning this is the first version of Terraria released on Android. But I also wanted to see if I could even find it online. With this being the first ever version of Terraria released on Android, and it being available for only 12 days, I could be the first to archive this ancient version. So I found this website that had most of the versions downloadable, and it had version 1.0, but it turns out this was only the free one. So I kept looking and found an archive.org website that had almost every version of Terraria with the paid versions. So I downloaded version 1.0 from there, and it had the same build number of 2331, meaning this version is the exact version of Terraria that I have. It was uploaded April 27, 2023, meaning anybody can download the file and play it for themselves. If I found this file a couple years ago, I could be the first person to archive it. But first, let's go over what this version actually contains, or actually what it doesn't contain. First of all, there is no Android exclusive bosses such as Turco or Lepus, and there is no Plantera, meaning at this point in development there could have only been the mechanical bosses as the last bosses. However, according to the wiki, all of this hard mode content does not even exist. I assume what happened is they took all the images currently in the PC version and didn't bother removing the content that wouldn't be added. But I guess we'll see. I do plan on killing at least a wall of flesh, assuming it exists, so sometime in this video we can confirm for sure if hard mode even existed. But if we assume it doesn't, it would make the wall of flesh the last boss, meaning the boss progression would basically be the King Slime, Eye of Cthulhu, Eater of Worlds, there was no Crimson, so the Braid of Cthulhu didn't even exist, Skeletron, and then the Wall of Flesh. much. But anyways, I'm sure you want to see me actually play it. But first, I need to go over how I got it running in the first place, because it's not as simple as just running the file. As I said before, this is an APK file, which will only run on Android devices, meaning anybody with an iPhone will not be able to run this. Another W for the Android community. But anyways, I couldn't install it on my Samsung Fold 4 or Flip 5. These phones were too new and I needed a very old version of Android to even run it. So I tried running it on my Samsung S9 or whatever this blue phone is. I was recording footage for this part of the video, and it turns out that I managed to get Terraria running on the S9. I guess the first time I tried installing the app, something happened, causing it to fail. Now despite it running, it still gave me an error saying it wasn't able to run. But after pressing OK, it seems to work fine. And for the blue phone, every time I try running it, it redirects me to the App Store. But if I turn off the Wi-Fi, it'll stop redirecting me. And after doing this, it seems to work perfectly fine. And with this being the case, the next phone that I mentioned will not actually be needed. But I already finished that section of the video, so I'm gonna leave it in. But I had one more phone that I could try, this being the Samsung Galaxy Alpha. This phone was made in 2012, which should run an APK made in 2013. And luckily it ran, meaning I was able to play the first version of Terraria on the first phone that I got. Now you may be wondering, why couldn't I run this on a device that I found it on? Well, as you can see, this is it running. The device is so old that the battery completely died, so I had to take the battery from a different tablet and attach it to this one. But even after this tablet was going to be way too slow, as it was made in 2012 and retailed for around $100. And I would have preferred a larger screen, and luckily I had this other tablet which was larger. Unfortunately, I had to do the same thing with the battery, and it turns out this tablet was actually way slower. So I had to find another tablet that had a decently sized screen, but also ran an older version of Android. And it turns out the Android version that was needed was 5.0. I'm assuming older versions work as well, and maybe some newer ones, but apparently my mom had a tablet that might work, but unfortunately it wouldn't turn on. So like the other two tablets, I had to connect the battery externally to the terminals. And luckily I ended up getting it working without breaking it. Not only that, but I was able to install and run Terraria on it. But I needed to buy a new battery for it. I didn't want to use a sketchy battery setup and risk it disconnecting and losing all my progress. But you may be wondering, why couldn't I run this all on an emulator? Well, I could actually install it and get it running on BlueStack, but unfortunately it wouldn't render properly, and obviously I couldn't play like this. And because BlueStack doesn't support very old versions of Android, I had to use a different emulator. But for reasons I forget, most emulators can't run the specific architecture that I needed. But I needed multiple fingers to play the game properly, meaning a single mouse wasn't gonna cut it. So I had to use a real device. But anyways, now getting on to actual gameplay. So after booting up the game, the first thing I had to do was create a character. But I already ran into the first issue. I'm not sure why this is, but I wasn't able to confirm the character name, meaning I could press enter all I wanted, but it wouldn't advance to the next screen. I was able to do this on my S9, but like I mentioned before, I didn't want to play on such a small screen. So after doing some thinking, I realized that a Bluetooth keyboard might just work. But unfortunately, I didn't have one, and I wasn't gonna go out and buy one just to create a character. But then I found another way. Before doing anything, I had to make sure that I was able to record the screen. And I wasn't gonna be able to just screen record normally because the tablet only had 5 GB of storage. So I used a program called Screen Copy. It would allow me to stream the device's screen to the computer, but it also allowed me to interact with it, meaning all I had to do was press enter on the computer's keyboard and it would enter in the game. So that's what I did, and eventually I created a character and then a world. And the first thing I noticed is I start with a copper broadsword as opposed to a copper short sword. This is the first of many exclusive features that we will see. And after opening my inventory, you will notice that the screen looks very different than the current Terraria. This was the original UI for the mobile version. Although this was the original version, in my opinion it was the superior version, as it is a lot more intuitive than the current cluttered version. The one reason why I won't play modern mobile Terraria is for this reason. I think that this old UI was just way better. But anyways, another thing that you will notice is that auto jump works on 2 and even 3 blocks. This makes movement slightly more bearable, as it was kind of hard to use in some cases. But after discovering that, I decided to cut down a tree, and as you can see, this circle appears. Unlike normal Terraria where every item has a specific range, any block within this circle is able to be mined. And you may notice in the corner that this slime is a little laggy. This is not the recording, this is actually just the tablet being very slow. This isn't so bad now, but when there are many particles on screen, it gets hard to play. I assume this is because the tablet hardware is just not good enough. But another issue that I found is that small cursor movements wouldn't register. As you can see here, it was hard to move from one block to another. Also ignore the mouse cursor. I forgot to move it off the screen when recording, but luckily for future clips I end up paying more attention. But anyways, after mining one piece of copper, which I didn't need, I created some platforms to get out of this pit, which is when I realized that one platform equates to one wood, which is why later you'll see me use blocks as opposed to platforms, which I would usually use. And after getting out of the pit, I moved to the left and found a desert with some strange water generation. And also here I realized that there are 2 musics playing. For later clips I end up turning off the in-game music, but for now you can just hear that something's off. But anyways, I eventually came across my first enemy, with that being a vulture. And while attacking it, I noticed that the audio quality isn't very good, as when hurting the vulture the sound effect wasn't playing, and some other sound effects were cut off. But after that I ran into the corruption, which ended up being extremely small. And then right after was the dungeon. I was able to walk from spawn to the dungeon in less than a minute, meaning this world was definitely a small world. However, I didn't get to decide, as when creating a world I was only able to choose a name. But anyways, while in the dungeon I realized you couldn't place torches on the walls, and then I proceeded to accidentally create 3 workbenches. I tried creating platforms, but for some reason the clicks weren't registering. But eventually I made my way over to the ocean, and as it turned night I realized that the player was glowing. This is one of those things that just makes the game more playable on a mobile device. So eventually I went into the ocean and then I went off screen. I thought this was a glitch, and then I realized later that it's actually just because I was zoomed in. But I ended up leaving the world to go back to spawn. I ended up doing this almost every time I had to go back to spawn, even if I had a magic mirror, because I was worried the game could crash at any moment, and I wanted to make sure it was saved. In the newer versions there's options to save the game without leaving. This is the case on 3DS. I would like to make a video on it, however unfortunately I'm not able to record the screen. But anyways, after cutting down some trees I realized that the max stack was only 250. This was the case on the old computer versions, furthermore confirming that this is an old version. I then proceeded to build a house with this wood, which was kind of annoying because block swap didn't exist. But what was even more annoying is that I had to use an axe to destroy the wood. But after the house was built I decided to do more exploring, which is when I found my first chest, which I got an aglet from. Also note that the aglet is not material, and with this information we can assume that the best boots that I can get are Spectre boots. But after that I tried destroying the chest and realized that it needed a hammer. I then placed down one of the 3 workbenches that I accidentally created earlier and created a wooden hammer. I ended up keeping this hammer on my player for the entire game, not only to destroy other chests but also doors and furnaces, and more notably life crystals, which is what I wanted, so I went exploring in a cave. And as you can see, here's a good example of the player glowing. It makes it easier for me to play and you to watch. I also then realized that when mining, it mines 3 wide. I don't know if this was the case on computer ever, but I do remember this being the case on mobile versions. And then I proceeded to find my first life crystal. It was also placed in a weird spot as it was only half on a block, but I didn't care, so I used my hammer to mine it and then I used it. And right after that it ended up saving my life as I got hit by a boulder and almost died to it. Now it should be noted that they don't do very much damage on the mobile versions. In this case it only did 110, meaning assuming I have more than 100 health I can almost always not die from it. There was also no sound at all, not from the pressure plate, the boulder, or it hitting the ground. In normal cases I would have heard something and then moved out of the way. So after that I mined some gold and then got the message saying that someone would like to settle down. In these old mobile versions it would tell you when an NPC was wanting to spawn in, and judging by the name it was a nurse, so I went back to the surface and created a house for her, and then discovered that the auto place feature for walls is very terrible, as it placed the walls literally everywhere except for where I wanted it. But after properly creating a house the nurse did arrive, and after that I decided to go explore the jungle, and notice that all the trees are just normal wood. This is the same for corruption trees, and I assume it's the same for snow biome trees, which at this point I did not realize, but there was no snow biome. In many of the old Terraria versions on computer and on 3DS, the snow biome wasn't guaranteed to spawn in your world, which is why in hard mode there was a snow globe that allows you to get snow. But like I said before, there isn't really a hard mode in this version, but even if there was, that feature wasn't added until later versions. But anyways, after getting out of the jungle I mined some iron and then remembered that they only stack up to 99. This isn't really anything special as it was the case for a very long time, but I figured I'd mention it for those who didn't know. I then tried going over to the edge of the world in the ocean, but ended up dying to a shark. You may also notice that I respawned instantly. I'm not sure why this is because it only happens sometimes, but it's pretty useful when you don't want to wait 15 seconds to respawn. I then went to go sell my second magic mirror and discovered it only sold for 10 silver. I was hoping to get a gold out of it as it sells for nowadays. But anyways, with nothing else to do I then went exploring a cave and ended up dying after all of my hearts were gone. I'm not sure why this is the case, I assume it's because of some rounding down, but this time when I died there was a death screen. But then after that I went to explore the jungle and then found a second life crystal, and then a couple minutes later died to an explosion, which I did not see. I then went back down in the normal cave to find a third heart, and after going back to the surface I was then able to create some iron armor and then explore the corruption, which is where I found a slightly broken altar. Aside from that, nothing really interesting is down there. I then went back down in the cave and found a fourth heart crystal. I also found my first underground house. As you can see, they look very different than what they do today, but in the chest I found an Eye of Cthulhu spawner. This would be useful for when I want to kill it. I then used the magic mirror to go back to spawn, and then realized that it uses 20 mana. It turns out the original magic mirrors on almost every version except for the computer did use mana, but after going back home I then decided to go to the jungle, which is where I found a glowing mushroom biome. It's strange that it spawned here, but I didn't find any anywhere else. You may also notice notice that I'm losing a lot of frames here. For some reason, this tablet isn't able to handle the glowing mushrooms very well, but I did end up finding the last heart crystal. And as you can see, the max amount of heart crystals I can use is only 5. I then end up finding a second house right after, which had Hermes boots. And then later, after exploring the jungle more, I had to heal and the glowing mushroom ended up being crossed out. It turns out you were able to restore 25 health from these glowing mushrooms. This isn't the case now, but it explains why it was used in the current day healing potions. I then ended up making my way so far down that I found a hell forge just in the jungle. These are supposed to be destroyed with a stronger hammer, but like the cactus, I'm able to just destroy the block underneath them. And because I was so far down, I decided to jump into the underworld. This ended up being a bad idea because I ended up dying and losing multiple gold. However, I died in lava, which ended up making me respawn instantly. And given that the 2 times that this happened I was in liquid, I figured that you respawn instantly if you were in liquid. However, later I think I respawn instantly if I die normally. But until now, I'm still not sure why this happens. But anyways, now with the Hermes boots, I figured I was ready to kill the Eye of Cthulhu. So I created an arena and waited for the next night. And it turns out the game thought I was also ready because I got the message saying that he was gonna spawn. So armed with a gold bow and a bunch of arrows, I was able to kill it pretty fast. So fast in fact that I figured I was gonna be able to kill it a second time. And that I did, so 2 Eye of Cthulhu's killed in a single night. And with this being the case, I was able to create both the War Axe of the Night and the Light's Bane, with 8 bars to spare. And now with the Eye of Cthulhu down, the Dryad decided to move in. And with nothing else to do, I decided to see what the Eater of Worlds was gonna be like. So after smashing some orbs, I got a musket and some bullets. And then after smashing the 3rd orb, it spawned. Unfortunately though, I wasn't able to make my way to an open area. And because of this, I wasn't able to do very much damage and then eventually died. You can also see that the frame rate is very low. Clearly the tablet wasn't able to process this many enemies on screen with a decent FPS count. But anyways, when I did die, I ended up respawning instantly, thus disproving the liquid theory. I then built another house and then realized that platforms also require a hammer to destroy, and then also that you can't place cactus. So cactus is only used for potions that I'm aware of, and the guide isn't overly helpful because you can't see what you can craft with stuff. Although admittedly the crafting menu does show what you can craft, although not all of it. But now armed with my musket, I was able to kill bees quicker, so I went down to the jungle and farmed for stingers for the blade of grass, ultimately for the Knight's Edge. However, first I needed all the other swords. But then I realized that the blade of grass needs 15 stingers, and because I didn't want to manually farm all of those bees, I decided to get a statue. And as I was searching for the statues, and right as I came across a goblin statue, a goblin army spawned. So I went home and fought the evasion. So after that, I went down in the cave to search for the bee statue again, and I had the goblin tinkerer spawn. He ended up spawning directly on my player. But because I didn't have the gold on me, I just decided to keep looking for the statue. But eventually I did find a bee statue. Now it should be noted that I wasn't originally going to look for a bee statue, as there was no telling if there was even going to be one in the world. However, I do remember coming across one, so I knew that there was one somewhere. But either way, it turns out that they don't even spawn the enemies. So if I wanted the blade of grass, I would have to farm the bees manually. But first, I wanted to get the Spectre boots. So with 15 gold coins, I brought the Tinkerer's workbench, the rocket boots, and combined them with the Hermes boots. And then I went down to farm bees in the jungle. But after 30 minutes of farming, I only ended up getting like 4 stingers. And because I didn't really need the blade of grass at the moment, I decided to go back down to the underworld. So after doing that, I ended up finding the first exclusive enemy, that being the Archdemon. I don't know why this was added because for all I can tell, it's the exact same as a normal demon, but one interesting thing to note is that on the 3DS, they drop crystal shards. However, you can't really craft anything with them as it would require hard mode anvils, which are not possible to get in pre-hard mode. But also while down in the underworld, I ended up finding a voodoo demon, and then getting the voodoo doll. And then while reading its description, it said it was consumable, meaning to spawn the wall of flesh you would just use it instead of throwing it in lava. But that's all I really needed for now, so I went back home and decided to kill the Eater of Worlds. This time I would make sure I can get to an open area, so I wouldn't die in a corner. But first I wanted to buy a lot of bullets, and the only way to do this is by clicking the buy button every time you wanted to buy a bullet. So if I wanted a stack of bullets, I would have to click it 250 times. But then I remembered that I can actually interact with the tablet using the computer. So I set up an auto clicker to click the bullets and buy a bunch. And after doing that, I set up the Eater of Worlds arena and then spawned him. Also while destroying the orbs, I ended up getting 2 meteors to land. I ended up using the War Axe of the Night for most of the battle as it did more damage than the sword. And the gun wasn't very useful. I'm not really sure why I thought it was going to be. But eventually I killed him and then I was going to go make the shadow armor. However, the full set of shadow armor requires 45 shadow scales. I only got 16, meaning if I wanted this armor, I would have to kill it at least 2 or 3 more times. And I would need to kill it even more if I wanted to have the pickaxe or the hammer. There also weren't any more orbs in the world, so if I wanted to kill it again, I would have to manually farm the rotten chunks and the mushrooms. So I decided to instead go for meteorite armor. So I created the pickaxe and went to go farm meteorite. So I dug up the entire meteorite and only crafted 65 meteorite bars. However, if I wanted the full armor, I would need 75. And then even more if I wanted the gun. So I went to go mine the other meteor that fell, this time using bombs to make it quicker, but it ended up turning night. And I also happened to be near the dungeon with an arena already created. So I decided to attempt Skeletron and ended up killing him first try. And then I went home and crafted the meteorite armor, and planned on creating a space gun, however I couldn't find where it was crafted. So after checking the wiki and going to the history page, it turns out it was created using the flintlock gun and a bunch of stars. So after getting the flintlock pistol, 10 stars, and another 30 meteorite bars, I was able to craft the space gun. And with this, I was then able to explore the dungeon and then got the mechanic. And then came across the second exclusive mob, that being this weird dragon skull. Much like the archdemon, I'm not sure why they added this, as normal cursed skulls already existed, but anyways, I then opened the first locked chest, but unfortunately only got a magic missile. I then farmed for a second key, which took over 10 minutes, to get the Muramasa. This is one of the only swords that actually swing properly, as for some reason all the other ones have a weird delay. This ended up being changed in the next update, but for now, this was going to be the weapon I used, and because I didn't want to spend another 10 minutes looking for a key, I ended up going back home. And because I was bored and I wanted something to do, I killed the Eye of Cthulhu, and then when day came, I decided to look for floating islands. I checked the entire left side of the world with no luck, and then checked the right side of the world and ended up finding 2. As you can see, they are very different than the current day versions, but more notably, the chests are locked, so there wasn't really anything useful here. And it was at this point where I didn't really know what else to do. There were a couple things I could have done, but they all required farming. Those being killing the king slime, which requires farming for gel, farming for keys both in the dungeon and for the sky islands, or farming for stingers for the blade of grass so I could get the Night's Edge later. But due to the spawn rates being really low on the mobile versions, I decided to not do any. So I decided to go kill the wall of flesh, but first I needed a elevator. But interestingly, while mining that, I had a blood moon. Normally this would be an important event because I would be able to get a money trough, but in this version I think it's just a normal night with a slightly red tint, and even that isn't very noticeable. So with that being the case, I went back down to finish the elevator, and while I was down in the underworld, I got a second voodoo doll and started making the bridge. I ended up making it 500 blocks long, which I figured was going to be long enough. So I tested what the wall of flesh was going to be like, and unfortunately he spawned behind me, and because I hadn't planned on this happening, I ended up dying because there was a building in the way. So then I went back down and waited for the guy to spawn and then tried spawning him again. Unfortunately, he didn't even spawn. I was a little confused at first, but then I remembered in the older versions when you died, the wall of flesh wouldn't despawn. So I ended up wasting the voodoo doll assuming that he was gone. And I did try going to the wall of flesh to see if he was still there, but unfortunately he was long gone. So I had to farm for another voodoo doll. And while doing that, I had this cursor glitch happen. This has happened multiple times before, but this time I was able to show it properly without any enemy or boss trying to kill me. As you can see, the movement and attack directions are pointed towards a single input. This means whenever I'm moving, it's shooting at the direction of my finger on the movement circle relative to the shooting circle. Basically, I can move wherever I want, but I'm always shooting to the left. If this happens, I have to remove all my fingers from the screen. This can happen the other way around, where I can shoot wherever I want, but I'm always moving to the right. This glitch has caused me to die to enemies in certain situations. I then attempted the wall of flesh a second time, and he spawned the same way, but this time I was ready as I destroyed a path through the house. And that cursor glitch I was just talking about ended up happening. As you can see at this point in time, I end up walking right off this building. This is obviously not a move I wanted to do because I wanted to move the other way entirely. However, I ended up failing this attempt because I almost died to fall damage. Along with that, there was no bridge and it was super laggy. And I didn't have another voodoo doll, so I had to go farm for one. And while doing so, I had this visual glitch where I had 2 things selected at once. But eventually I got another voodoo doll and then attempted the wall of flesh again, but this time at the end of the bridge. But unfortunately I ended up dying again. I think if I made the bridge longer I could have done it, or I could just get better armor. So I decided to get full molten armor. And the easiest way to mine for hellstone is using an obsidian skin potion. So I got some obsidian and made a bunch of potions. And it turns out I needed 90 bars for the full set of armor, and then another 70 if I wanted the pickaxe and sword. So I figured this was going to take a very long time, so I went down to the underworld and started mining. And then I eventually died in lava because the obsidian skin potion ran out, but then I ended up having 464 blocks, which didn't end up taking too long and was about how much I needed. But now I needed to get a bunch of obsidian, and because I didn't want to go underground and look for water and lava, I brought it to the surface, where I used the old water duplication glitch, but it didn't seem to work. From what I can tell on YouTube, it only works in multiplayer, but unfortunately multiplayer didn't exist in this version, so I had to use the current way of duplicating water. I did the same for lava, and then I got a bunch of obsidian, but while doing that a second goblin army arrived, which didn't really bring anything useful besides now I have a clothier hat. But because the liquid duplication glitch was taking way too long, I figured it was going to be faster if I did manually find a lava pool underground. So that I did, and I got pretty lucky with this one because it was right under the water pool that I created. I also found this weird glitch where I'm not able to get air here. I assume it's because I'm in water, but there's water above me. But anyways, I went back to the servers with my obsidian and hellstone and created 123 molten bars. I then proceeded to create the full molten armor and didn't have enough for the sword, which I didn't end up needing because I never ended up farming for the blade of grass. But now with the molten armor, I'm not able to use the space gun without using mana. So looking on the wiki, I was able to get the Phoenix Blaster, but this first required me to get the handgun from the dungeon, which I didn't want to do, but I couldn't think of any other option. Unfortunately, it took a long time, but eventually I got it. So I brought it home and crafted the Phoenix Blaster. I think it shoots faster than on the computer, so it's a pretty good weapon for the Wall of Flesh. I just needed to buy a lot of bullets, which would have taken a long time, but luckily I was able to use my mouse and an auto clicker. I also noticed that the illegal gun parts cost 75 gold. It's only used for the sand gun, so I'm not sure why they made it so expensive. But anyways, with over 700 bullets, I decided to try the Wall of Flesh once more. And this time I was able to kill it pretty easily. Something interesting though was that there was only the message saying it was killed, meaning the spirits of light and dark were not released. But anyways, I then got the items that it dropped, which interestingly was 2 emblems and a laser rifle, which means that some hard mode items exist, but not all of them. There was also no hammer, meaning if destroying the altars was a possibility, I wouldn't be able to. So I ended up going home and checking for the hollow. Although there was no message, I still wanted to check if it existed, but unfortunately the answer is no. However, I did come across another exclusive enemy, that being the Dragon Snatcher, which is the hard mode variant of the Man-Eater, meaning there does exist some hard mode content, but not enough to call it hard mode. The Dryad also doesn't sell hollowed seeds, meaning the hollow is not possible to obtain. But anyways, there was one more thing I wanted to do before I stopped playing, and that is killing the King Slime. So after creating the golden crown and then creating the slime crown, I spawned the King Slime, and obviously it was pretty easy. I ended up making 58 gel back, which is not the 99 that it required, but I don't really care. So that was the first ever released Terraria version for mobile. In total, it took me 5.5 hours to complete. According to the wiki, it says that hard mode content wasn't added until later. However, as we know now, this isn't necessarily the case. As we've seen, some hard mode items do exist, and according to their IDs, it almost proves that pixie dust exists. And if pixie dust exists, maybe in the code the hollow exists. But according to what we have found, it seems to be ported from Terraria 1.1. And with that being the case, hard mode should have existed, because most of the textures and some of the content does exist. And with that being the case, I wonder how much of the content is available. It might be possible to get hard mode ores because of the broken altar that we found earlier, but I'm not going to find out right now, as that tablet was really annoying to play on, and I don't really want to play more. However, if this video gets 1,000 likes, I might just do it, but I can almost guarantee that that won't happen, but feel free to prove me wrong.